So now you got to sound spiritual. Okay, last week, and we prayed at the beginning, so that prayer covers this. Last week we talked about how the Gospel of Mark describes the resurrection, and what did you find interesting? But how did the Gospel of Mark, according to Mark, how was the resurrection described? What do you remember about those last 8 verses of Mark?
That a few women went to the tomb.
Okay, you got people going to the tomb. You have
the stone rolled away.
Stone rolled away. What made the ending of Mark kind of distinct?
It just dropped.
Okay, it just dropped. What do you mean by just dropped?
It didn't go into the rest of what the other 4 Gospels did, or the other 3 Gospels.
You had no appearances. It just stopped. It just kind of stopped in the Gospel of Mark. And last week we said what was kind of the point of it just stopping. What do you think was the point? And remember, one of the things really important as we approach this, because this is what I believe, and I want you to at least think about it too, is all the evangelists, and we're talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, all of them are shaping a story to make points. They're not historians, they're not reporters, they're not writing facts. They're shaping a story to make a deeper point. What do you think was the point? What was Mark getting at in the way he described the resurrection?
He was challenging us.
I think he was challenging us. Challenging us to do what?
To look further into it.
Okay, maybe to look further into it. What else was he challenging? Because remember, how did it end? The young man at the tomb says to the women, go and tell the disciples, right? And what do the women do? They don't tell anybody. Says they told nobody because they were afraid. Becomes a challenge to us. What are we going to do in light of the same event? Now, when we read the story in Mark, would you consider it, and I know I was talking to somebody about passion plays and how it's presented in those, would you consider the Gospel of Mark, the way he describes the resurrection, really dramatic? No. Doesn't seem to be really dramatic. In fact, you could almost say it's a little
boring.
Well, we can't call the Bible boring. My goodness gracious. Yes, it's boring. The Gospel of Mark, and the way he describes it, is kind of boring, right? You got women coming in, didn't even say an angel, just a young man, dressed in white. Yeah, Betty?
He's like a reporter recording facts.
Yeah, well, it's not and the facts are not all that exciting. They hear the man says he's great, which, that sounds okay. But I mean, it's no light shooting from the tomb and, Jesus showing up and all. It's just empty tomb. Go and tell the disciples and the women. Now, if you wanted to spice up this story, what might be some things you'd add?
Thunder and lightning.
Oh, let's have some thunder and lightning. That sounds good. What else? So we got
Wind.
Call it a miracle.
Jesus. What's that?
Call it a miracle.
Okay, let's do miracles. Yeah. Okay. We got lightning, sort of like in a Frankenstein movie. Thunder and lightning and stuff. Okay, you got miracles. What else are you going to do to spice it up?
Jesus ascending in front of us.
Oh man, if you had Jesus coming out of the tomb, that would be really neat, right? With a bunch of angels flying around.
Yeah, harps playing.
What? And it's nighttime. Yeah, nighttime, because it makes it even more spectacular with all the lights going on. Now, if you felt you needed, if you started adding this stuff to the story, to what Mark had. You got Mark and you say, man, that's kind of boring. I want to spice it up a little bit. What might that tell you about when? When would people want to spice up the story a little bit? Early or later?
Later.
Okay, why might they want to spice it up later?
They want you to believe.
Okay, they want you to believe, right? They want to, this story's been around a long time. They may want to make it a little more interesting, a little more entertaining, a little more exciting. Okay? And I think that's what we've got when we look at the Gospel of Matthew. We'll look at his account of the resurrection tonight, and we see that it is a little bit, spiced out. Now, for those of y'all who weren't here last week, and you hear me say that, you may say, oh, well, he doesn't believe in resurrection, because he's saying Mark does it this way in Matthew. Understand, we've got 4 guys telling stories about who Jesus is. And they want their audience to believe certain things about who he was. Now, all the stories are right. They all teach lessons. It's just that they're trying to teach different lessons. And when the early church put these 4 Gospels together, they weren't stupid. They knew the stories were different. But they felt all of them conveyed an important message about who Jesus was. Therefore, they were all important, even though they weren't identical. And one of the things that I encourage strongly is you let every gospel speak for itself. You don't want to add to it other. You don't say, well, here's Mark, but we're going to add a little bit of Matthew. We're going to add a little bit of Luke. We don't want to do that because each evangelist wants us to see Jesus in a certain way. And so let's listen to him. That's how God inspired it. So we don't want to add and shape and kind of reshape it because then we don't end up with much of anything. Okay, so today we're going to look at Matthew. Now remember, last time we talked a little bit about Mark as a gospel. We're going to do the same thing with Matthew. And when you look at the gospels, where does Matthew stand in the list?
First.
4 gospels. First. So you could get the idea that Matthew is number 1. We're number 1. Matthew's the first. But Matthew, I suggested last week, which one was first? Probably first. Okay, Mark was probably first, somewhere around 70 A.D. Matthew will follow, I think Matthew will follow Mark. Probably written after Mark because 95% of the Gospel of Mark is in the Gospel of Matthew. 95%. Okay? But a lot of other stuff too, because remember Matthew is 28 chapters and Mark is just barely over 16. So you've got Matthew with almost all of Mark in it and other stuff. Some of the stuff you also find in Luke, some of it unique to Matthew in his gospel. Now, when you think about these evangelists, what I want you to visualize is a guy that has a pile of papers on his desk, little scraps of paper. And they're all stories about Jesus. Because remember, these guys are writing. Matthew is probably writing 60 years after Jesus is gone, maybe longer. Little scraps of paper about stuff that Jesus did, little stories. And what they're doing is they're taking all these little pieces of paper and organizing it into a story that conveys the meaning that they feel they want their audience to understand. They want to see Jesus in a certain way because that's why they believe he was important. And so they're organizing all this stuff. And that's what Matthew is doing. Matthew follows Mark's chronology. What does that mean to follow his chronology?
Timeline.
It's timeline. So Mark has a certain timeline when things happen. Matthew tends to follow Mark's timeline. What Matthew does, which is kind of interesting, is the stuff that's from Matthew, unique to Matthew, and stuff that is in Matthew and Luke. Matthew likes to organize it into big groups of stuff. Matthew is the one that has the Sermon on the Mount. Three chapters, 5, 6, and 7, where Jesus is preaching on a mountain. Matthew also loves mountains. Mountains are all over the place in Matthew, because Matthew likes to draw parallels between Jesus and Moses. That seems to be a big deal for Matthew. But he has all this sermon stuff together in the Sermon on the Mount. If you look at Luke, takes the same material, but he scatters it through his gospel. So the Sermon on the Mount in Luke is in a lot of places. Matthew, it's all together. Yeah, all bunched together. He put all the parables together. Matthew, that's the way Matthew thinks. He likes to organize things based on theme, and he fits that into, Mark's chronology. Okay? So Matthew is probably following Mark, maybe 20 years, 15, 20 years after Mark. We know it's after the destruction of the temple because as Matthew tells his story, it seems as though he knows and everybody else knows that Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple was destroyed.
Where did Matthew get his information?
Well, I think Matthew 1 had Mark in front of him. So Matthew had the Gospel of Mark in some form in front of him. Then Matthew and Luke, and we know that because Matthew and Luke have material in common. They're all teachings. They call it Q. Matthew and Luke had common material that each of them use in a slightly different way. Matthew bunches it together. Luke scatters it in his gospel. So they're using common material. And then both Matthew and Luke have unique material that they've drawn from someplace else. Whether it's something in their community, whether it's somebody that shared it, don't know. But Matthew is drawing a lot from Mark, almost all of Mark, drawing a lot from what Luke is using and then some of his own materials. Some of the parables in Matthew are unique. The 10 virgins are unique. Jesus, when he says at the end, the Son of Man comes and separates the sheep from the goat, and I was hungry and you gave me food. That's unique to Matthew. You don't see that in the other three Gospels. So he's drawing from different sources. Yeah?
Wasn't John there at the crucifixion?
Was it John? Well, we're going to talk about that in fact, the next. So hold that thought, Betty. The one other thing that you see really a difference is that Matthew's birth stories are really unique versus Luke's. Luke and Matthew are the only ones that talk about birth. Maybe John, kind of. But they're the only two, but their birth stories are entirely different. And so one of them, has the kings. Matthew has the kings. Luke has the shepherds. Matthew has no shepherds. Luke has no kings. So you've got these two stories. And I think theologically there's a reason for it. Matthew's seems to be real consistent. Again, that parallel, Jesus and Israel. Luke is working something a little different.
Luke's a little bit more romantic in his
Yeah, you could say that. We'll look at Luke next week. Luke, that's a good way to put it, Betty. Luke sort of is romantic. Kind of romantic in the way he looks at life and stuff. Luke also really lifts out the poor. The poor are really important in Luke. Women in a very idealized way in Luke. Mark, I think, is more honest about women. Luke is a little romanticized. But so we've got this going on in the Gospel of Matthew. One thing that people don't realize is the names for the Gospels were given about 200 years after they were written. So it wasn't like the earliest forms of these Gospels had the Gospel according to Matthew up top. It didn't. That was given later. And so what you do is you've got to look at the book itself to see if the author is mentioned. And you do have, like Luke, in Luke, the author is mentioned. Not only the author, Luke, but who he's writing to. And that we'll talk about that next week. That person is a little, iffy because the name is almost too good to be true. But at least it has the author written in there. Or like Paul's letter, the Apostle Paul to the Romans. If you look at the Gospel of Matthew, does Matthew's name appear in the Gospel of Matthew?
No.
It never appears. So who wrote the Gospel of Matthew?
We don't know.
Don't know. Know what people said 200 years after it was written, but how would they know? And if I wanted you to read, if I have something that I believe is really important that will change your life, am I going to say this was written by the Apostle Matthew, or this was written by somebody named George? Which one are you going to read? The one written by the Apostle Matthew, right? Because it has more. So there's good reason to give it the name of an apostle. There's no reason to give it another name. And so in the early church, there were Gospels according to Philip, there were Gospels according to Thomas, there were Gospels according to Peter that were circulated. Now, Peter didn't write it, Thomas didn't write it, Philip didn't write it. They didn't write it because they were written really late. But people said, oh, yeah, the Apostle Philip wrote this. You got to read it. Because they wanted people to read it, right? And so they gave it names that they didn't, that didn't reflect the writer. So we want to be really hesitant before we say, oh, Matthew, well, he was an eyewitness. Mark, what did Mark know? He didn't know anything. There wasn't an apostle named Mark. So Matthew must be more valuable than Mark or Luke. Well, no, that's not the case. We don't know who wrote it for sure. So we don't want to attribute this like this has more value than the others. Okay? All right, and that's the same thing with John. Even John, when you look at John, there's no author in John. The only thing it says is the disciple whom Jesus loved. Well, who is that? I don't know. Does it say it in the book? No. So I don't know who wrote it. Just somebody who Jesus loved. All right, so we don't want to give too much credence to the author as somehow shaping the way we read it in the church. The audience for Matthew would seem to be influenced by Judaism, but aren't really solid Jews. They aren't people that know about Judaism. They seem to be Jews, but they don't know a lot about it. Now, what might be some things that would indicate that they were Jewish? What would be some stuff you would look for in a book or a gospel written for Jews? What's going to be some things that we're going to expect to see in it? What's that?
Repetition.
Okay, you might see some repetition. Okay, what else?
Following the law.
Okay, you're going to see stuff about following the law.
Well,
Okay, maybe some details.
the Passover, you're talking a lot about the Passover.
Okay, you're going to have the festivals.
The tradition.
Yeah, the traditions of the Jews. You're going to expect to see that. And all of what y'all are saying, we see in the Gospel of Matthew. We see this repetition. We see traditions being important. We see, details. We see a lot of allusions to the Old Testament. So certainly it's a group that values the Jews. What you, though, see in Matthew, which would cause me to think that they might have been Jews, but not very sophisticated Jews, is that Matthew feels the need when Jesus does something that's in line with the Old Testament. Matthew will say, and he'll say it over and over again, this was done to fulfill prophecy. This was done to fulfill prophecy. Now, why might that show that he was writing to Jews that may not have known their Bible very well?
It validates what he's doing, what he's talking about.
Yeah. Well, if they knew their Bible, would they need to say, now, this fulfills prophecy? If you know your Bible, what?
You would know it.
You already know it. You don't have to say, this fulfills. You already know it. We see that in Luke. Luke, I think, is written to a very sophisticated Jewish audience because he's got all these fulfillments of prophecy, but it's got to be intentional. But he never says, oh, Jesus did this to fulfill prophecy, because I think his audience already knew. He didn't have to tell them. They knew. Matthew's audience must not know. Therefore, Matthew feels the need to point it out. And he points it out over and over and over again. A lot of images, you talked about the traditions, a lot of images in Matthew are really tied to Judaism. Like I said, mountains are big deals. Why would a Jew make mountains a big deal? Moses, yeah. That Jesus in Matthew kind of parallels the history of Israel and Moses in particular. Geez Louise, in Matthew, this is bizarre. But again, we're talking about a guy shaping a story. Jesus performs miracles. His greatest teachings are on a mountain. Right? His Sermon on the Mount is on a mountain. In Luke, most of the Sermon on the Mount is done, they call it the Sermon of the Plain. He's not on a mountain at all. His last appearance, Jesus' last appearance is on a mountain in Matthew. What is really odd is it says he does healings on mountains. healings on mountains. What does that mean if he's healing people on mountains?
He's carting them up there.
They're having to drag the lame up a mountain for Jesus to heal them. You know, why didn't he do what? Come down to the valley and do the healing.
Why are you making me drag?
Yeah, why are you dragging Aunt Sarah all the way up to the top of the mountain for healing? It doesn't make sense unless you want to look at it theologically, that Moses did his great things on mountains, so does Jesus. So we don't want to worry about that kind of stuff too much because he's drawing this parallel. At the birth story, Matthew's the only one that talks about Jesus being born and then going to Egypt. The Holy Family goes to Egypt. Well, who went to Egypt? Well, Moses was in Egypt before. How did Moses get to Egypt? Joseph and Jacob. Israel, and Jacob's name was Israel. Israel went to Egypt. What happens to Jesus later? He comes from Egypt. Who comes from Egypt? Moses and Israel. You know, so we got this parallel. Luke doesn't mention that. John doesn't mention it. Mark doesn't mention it. But Matthew does, because he sees this parallel. Jesus sort of personifies the whole history of Israel, if you look at his life and ministry, and in particular Moses. Okay, this is just some stuff to file away. And and I don't know why there's a big gap there. There's a strong emphasis in Matthew on the kingdom of heaven, because you see that a lot. Jesus talking about the kingdom of heaven, but also on the dramatic. And we're going to see that in just a little bit. Matthew is dramatic. I'm not going to call him a drama queen, because that has a whole different meaning. So I don't want to do that. But he is certainly a guy that likes dramatic stuff. Okay? All right. If you've got Bibles, you might want to turn to Matthew 28, verses 1 through 10. It is going to be up on the screen. So geez, that wasn't right.
It was.
Yeah, it was on the screen. There it is again. After the Sabbath, the first day of the week was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And suddenly, and you want to keep in mind, you might want to open to Matthew 28, but keep your thumb in Mark 16, because there'll be some comparisons. Other than went to see the tomb, and suddenly there was a great earthquake. For an angel of the Lord descending from heaven came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like white lightning, and his clothing white as snow. For fear of him, the guard shook and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, do not be afraid. I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has been raised. As he said, come see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples. He has been raised from the dead, and indeed he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him. This is my message for you. So they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them and said, greetings. And they came to him and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me. Okay. This is the resurrection account in Matthew. Now, when does all this occur?
The day after the Sabbath.
Okay, day after the Sabbath, right? And who is coming to the tomb?
Same ladies.
Okay, well, we don't have the same lady. We've got Mary and the other Mary. Remember, in Mark, we had three. We had three women coming to the tomb. The Salome was there too. So we've got two women coming to the tomb. Why might two be significant? That there are two of them.
Witness.
Okay, you got a witness. Because if you have only one, you don't have a witness. But if you got two, that qualified by Jewish law. So you believe. Okay, so Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went. Now, why are they going there?
They were going to prepare his body.
Yeah, they're there to prepare his body. You're right, Benny. The only problem is, according to Matthew, why are they there coming? Does it say anything in Matthew about coming to prepare his body?
No.
No, it doesn't. In fact, in Matthew, why are they coming?
Went to see Jesus.
They are coming to see what?
The tomb.
The tomb. So they're not coming to prepare the body. Why are they not there to anoint the body? I mean, that's what it said in Mark. That's what it's going to say in Luke. Why are they not there to anoint the body?
They can't push that stone aside.
Well, but in this, is there any concern about the stone? No. Remember in Mark, he said, the women were there. They were concerned about rolling away the stone because the stone was big. Made sense. They had to anoint the body. In this, any mention about the women being concerned about the stone? Why aren't they worried about the stone?
Well, maybe it's because you should already know that.
Well, no, real basic. Why are they not worried about the stone?
Because it's not there.
Because they're not there to anoint the body. All they're there to do is take pictures of the tomb. Well, that's right. They didn't have pictures. Draw pictures of the tomb. That's all the reason they're there. Now, my question is, why are they not there to anoint the body? Yeah. Why might they not be there to anoint the body?
They had faith.
Could be faith.
Maybe it hadn't been 3 days yet.
Hadn't been 3 days yet. Both of which are good comments.
There was an earthquake.
Well, there was an earthquake. Listen to this. This is what Matthew has already said. This is in the 26th chapter. The woman, when he's eating at the home of Simon the leper, and the woman comes in and breaks the perfume. And this is how Matthew describes what she does. Matthew 26:12. By pouring this ointment on his body, she was preparing him for burial. The woman, before the crucifixion, when he was having dinner with Simon the leper, the woman anointed his head and feet with oil. And Matthew said she was preparing his body for burial. Why are the women not there to anoint his body? Because he was already anointed. He was already prepared for the burial. And Matthew knew it or believed it. Therefore, he can't have the women coming to do it again. It already was done. So the women are just there to see the tomb, right? That's all this says. Okay, now, we've got, what happens?
Great earthquake.
You got this huge earthquake. And what happens with the earthquake?
Causes an angel to descend.
Okay, we got an angel descending, huge earthquake, angel descending from heaven, and what does the angel do?
Rolls away the stone.
Rolls away the stone and
sits on it.
Sits on top of it. Now remember the Gospel of Mark. They get there and what? When they come to the tomb, they find what?
The stone rolled away.
The stone rolled away. This, we've got, what happened?
Stone's still there.
Earthquake, right? Angel coming down. Stone being rolled away. Jeez Louise. This is like a Steven Spielberg movie. This is really exciting stuff going on. Now, in Matthew, have we seen similar things? Did I hear somebody say yes?
Yeah.
Yes. Very good. At the crucifixion, when you look at the crucifixion story in Matthew, chapter 27, just a few verses before, when it says Jesus was crucified. Now, in Mark, Jesus dies. The centurion looks at it. Mark says, saw the way that he died and said what? Surely he is the Son of God. In Matthew, this is what it says. And see if this changes it just a little bit. At that moment, the temple of the curtain was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks were split. Tombs were opened and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to men. Now that's the crucifixion. What happens? What's the result of that? That's pretty good stuff. Dead people walking. It's like the Walking Dead.
Yeah.
This is a big deal, right?
Where'd they go after them?
No.
Okay.
They were alive again.
And this is what it says. That's 27, 51 through 53. At 54, this is what it says. Now when the centurion and those with him who were keeping watch over Jesus saw the earthquake and what took place, they were terrified and said, truly this man was the Son of God. Now in Mark, he just sees how he dies. And it says he's the Son of God. In Matthew, what happens when Jesus dies? Special effects.
Special effects.
Special effects. We got rocks splitting, earth shaking, dead people walking.
The curtains.
Lord, the curtain torn. And the people, we know Matthew wants to emphasize it because it says when the centurion and those with him saw what happened, they were terrified. They were scared. So yeah, it was meant to be dramatic. Now, what is Matthew, as he's shaping the story, what point is he making about the death of Christ?
Big deal.
It was a huge deal. This was a cosmic event. This affected all of creation. This was huge. Changed the universe. That's what Matthew was saying. Is he right? Yeah, he's right. The death of Jesus Christ did change the universe, right? Mark says he saw Jesus die on a cross and said, truly he's the Son of God. The Son of God dies on a cross. What is Mark emphasizing?
The resurrection.
Well, resurrection, but what kind of death is he doing? Because it says he sees how he dies. Simplicity of the death. Jesus has sacrificed himself. Jesus has sacrificed himself. And as sacrificing himself, shows himself to be the Son of God. Is Mark right?
Yeah.
Yes, Mark is right. Then both are right. Cosmic event, but also an event that points to sacrificial. That's what I mean by these guys are shaping the story to convey messages. And that's why we don't want to bring Matthew into Mark, because then it changes the whole meaning of Mark. Changes the whole meaning of the crucifixion in Mark. Just like taking it out changes the whole meaning in the Gospel of Matthew. But we have had Matthew do the same thing. Now, Rocky, if you are right, and I believe you are right, and he's saying about the crucifixion, this is the event that changes. This is a cosmic event. By having the same thing happening here, what is he saying about the resurrection?
It's a big deal.
Cosmic event again. These are cosmic events that change the universe. Nothing is the same.
Only the true Son of God could cause something.
Only God can cause
Yeah,
it.
and
This is a cosmic event. This changes everything. Okay? And the very creation shakes. Now, that's what he's writing. That's what he's conveying to us. Is that right? You better believe it is.
Sure.
Okay. So, now, how does the angel comes down, and it's called an angel this time. But understand, angels didn't acquire wings until the Middle Ages. So, he's a messenger. You know, he doesn't necessarily have to have wings. Well, tell me about his appearance.
White.
What does he look like?
An angel.
He's white. Or at least his clothes are white. But they're not just white.
They're gold as well.
Well, his appearance was like lightning. And his clothing white as snow. What is being described here? With whom is he associating this figure? Okay, he is really, really bright. What is that? To whom is that associated?
God.
Associated with God. In fact, you could look at a little passage of Daniel where it talks about what Daniel calls the Ancient of Days, which is this figure that's going to come back. Ancient of Days, dressed the same way. I don't think it's an accident. You know, this is a godly figure. Not God, but certainly someone associated with God is doing that. Now, what happens? Who has been added to this story, or who is in this story? I don't want to say added because Mark just doesn't mention it. Who's mentioned here that wasn't mentioned in Mark?
The guards.
Okay, in Mark we don't have any mention of the guards at all, right? What happens to the guards? They were afraid, which is interesting because the same word is used here as used for the centurion when he witnessed all the stuff that was going on at the death. The guards have the same experience at the resurrection. They are terrified, and what happens to them? They become
Believers.
like, well, it doesn't say they become believers. They become like what? Dead men, right? Now, why would he mention that? Why do you think? Because remember, Matthew is shaping this. He doesn't have to include everything. He can pick and choose what he wants in this story. Why do you think Matthew wants us to know that the guards who were there, I mean, the other three evangelists don't mention guards. Why does Matthew want us not only to know that there were guards there, but when this happened, they became so terrified, they became like dead men?
They were stunned.
Okay, they were in shock. Why does he want us to see these guards in shock?
Powerless.
Okay, they were absolutely powerless because they lacked belief. We're going to find out later in this story, when we get to like verse 11, that there's a story evidently that developed, that Matthew's community knows about, maybe the other three don't. That the guards, the priests convinced the guards to lie and say that the disciples stole the body. And there was a rumor that the disciples stole the body. That evidently, according to Matthew, he said was started by the guards. He wants to make sure that we, the reader, know that the guards were there. They were frightened. They witnessed this. Therefore, if you hear that the guards at the tomb said this about the disciples stealing the body, we, the reader, know that it is a lie. They were convinced to do that by the priests. Okay, so the guards are included because of this story later. The angel says to the women, what do they say? What does he say to the women?
Don't be afraid.
Okay, don't be afraid. I know who you're looking for. Who are they looking for? Jesus, which actually they really aren't, because they were looking to see the tomb. But he says they're looking for Jesus, identifies Jesus. How does he identify Jesus?
Crucified.
The one who was crucified. Why do you think the angel wants to say, oh yeah, the one that was crucified?
He wants to let them know they're at the right place, I guess.
Okay, wants to let them know that they're at the right place. Who else does he want to let them know they're at the right place? Us, the reader. Wants to make sure we, the reader, know that they are at the right place. And this is, again, reminding us that these two events are kind of tied together. What does he say about Jesus?
He has been raised.
Okay, that he has been raised. Again, passive verb, which means what?
Somebody did it for him.
Somebody did it for him. Who did it for him?
God
did it. Jesus didn't cause himself to rise. If he did, then he offers no hope for us because what?
We can't do that.
We are incapable of causing ourselves to be raised from the dead. But God can do it. And we know God can do it because God did it. And when did God do it? Boom, right here. So we know he can do it for us because he did it for Jesus, the Son of Man. All right, so was raised. What command does he give?
Hurry.
Okay, tells him to go quickly. Now, we got some parallels, right? Because in Mark, we got the same thing going on, right? Go quickly and do what?
Tell his disciples.
Okay, tell the disciples what?
That Jesus is alive.
Okay, Jesus has been raised from the dead, and he is doing what? Going ahead of them to Galilee, and they will see him there. Now, in Matthew's story, is Jesus going to go after the resurrection to Galilee? Is he going to do that?
Yeah.
Yes, he is. And because at the end of Matthew, what happens? He's got his disciples there, and what does Jesus do? He says, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, Holy Spirit, and teaching them all that I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always to the end of the age. He's going to give them what? Great Commission. So he's going to go ahead of them to Galilee. So that's going to happen. The angel tells the women to go and tell the disciples. Now, when the young man in Mark tells the women to go and tell the disciples, the women go and hide. They go and tell no one because they were scared. They were afraid. Okay, that's what it says in Mark. Now, in Matthew, he tells the women something very similar. And what do the women do?
They left.
They leave quickly, which is what the angel said, to go quickly, right? Okay, he said, don't be afraid. They're still afraid, but they're also feeling
They have
Happy.
to go tell.
Happy, great joy. And why are they running?
Tell the disciples.
They are going to tell the disciples. In other words, how do we compare the women in Mark versus Matthew?
No comparison.
No comparison. Because what are the women doing in Matthew?
Doing what they're told.
They are doing exactly what the angel tells them to do. Where in Mark, they do
Nothing.
nothing. Okay, now, by having the women do this, remember, suggested in Mark's gospel that Mark is very subtly challenging us. You know, we're at the tomb too. The angel has said to us the exact same thing he said to the women. The women failed Jesus. Now, what are you going to do? Are you going to fail him too? Just like the disciples, just like the crowds, just like the leaders, just like the women? Are you going to fail him? Or are you going to do what he tells you to do? That's what I think Mark is working on. What is Matthew conveying? What is Matthew trying to tell us?
Not be afraid.
Yeah, don't be afraid. This is our mission. This is our purpose. This is why we're here. And you know something? Even though the women were feeling fear, they are also feeling joy. And did what they were told. We're going to see something very similar when he gives the Great Commission. Bad translation in every English translation I've read. That's kind of arrogant for me to say, but it's true. It says at the end, when the disciples are on the mountain in Galilee, it says that when Jesus was there, appeared to them, it says that they believed, and in English translations it says they believed but some doubted, which infers that some believed and some doubted. But that's not what the Greek says, because in the Greek the word some doesn't appear. Instead, in Greek it said they believed and they doubted. They both believed and doubted. You know, so both were there. We got the same thing going on here. The women are what? They're afraid. Why are they afraid?
I mean, this doesn't happen.
Yeah, this doesn't happen. People don't rise from the dead. They're afraid. But you know what? They also feel joy. The disciples on the mountain, they believe, but you know what? They're human beings. The guy who is dead is there in front of them. Yeah, maybe, maybe. Okay, so, in other words, I think what both are saying is, if you're afraid, that's okay. You know, you can still do great things for God. If you doubt, that's okay. You know, the disciples doubted. You can doubt and still do what God has called you to do. I think a powerful lesson. So they run. Now, what happens as they're running? Yes! What happens?
They meet Jesus, don't
They meet Jesus, right? They meet Jesus as they're leaving. So we got Jesus appearing for the first time, right? And when they meet Jesus, what do? Well, Jesus says what to them? Greetings. Now, remember, what are the women doing when they meet Jesus? What are they doing?
Running.
They're running, right? And they're running to do what?
Tell the disciples.
Tell the disciples, right? They're running to tell the disciples. And why are they running to tell the disciples? Because they were told to. In other words, the women are doing what? They are doing what they were told to do. They were doing their mission, their job, right? And as they're running to do the job, who all of a sudden appears to be with them? Jesus appears to be with them. Now, if Matthew is again trying to teach something deeper than just facts, what is he suggesting? As these women are leaving to do their job, what they were called to do, who meets them on the way? Jesus meets them. What might he be suggesting?
That he's always with us.
That he's with us. That when people do what they are called to do, Jesus is with them. Now, are we going to hear that later? Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them all that I have commanded you. And lo, I am what? With you always to the end of the age. Jesus was with the women as they were doing their mission. Jesus is going to be what? With us as we do ours. And remember, right at the beginning, chapter 1 of Matthew, we already know Jesus is going to be with us because Matthew is the only one that gives Jesus a special name. What name appears in chapter 1 of Matthew? This one will be called Jesus because he will save his people from their sin. He's also going to be called Emmanuel, which means God with us. So Jesus was God with us at the beginning. He's going to be God with us at the end. Jesus was with the women as they're leaving the tomb doing their job. Now, what do the women do when they see Jesus? Okay, they go and take hold of his feet. Now, I think this is really important. They take hold of his feet. Why is that so important that they grab hold of his feet?
They didn't feel as though they were worthy any other way.
Okay, well, they're worshiping him, which shows that they see him as what?
As the Messiah.
As God, right? Because you don't worship a human being, you worship God. But they're grabbing hold of his feet. What does that say about Jesus?
Want him to stay. They don't want him
Okay, they want him to stay, yeah. What else does it say about him?
His feet had been nailed.
His feet have been nailed?
They recognize him.
Recognize him? If I am going to grab hold of your feet, that means what about you?
You're
Here, put your
tangible.
foot up. Please. I'm grabbing hold of your feet.
You're
What does it
tangible.
mean?
You're tangible.
It is a physical thing. You are a physical being, right? You are physical. You are not a ghost.
Seeing if he's really there.
Because if you were a ghost, what would my hands do? Go right through it, right? And Jesus, they grabbed hold of Jesus' feet, which means what? He was a physical being, which means the resurrection wasn't a spiritual resurrection. His soul wasn't raised. He was raised whole, body and soul. He was raised. And other people who have been with me in other studies, that's one of the things that Jews really valued, that you didn't have disembodied souls floating around. You know, when you lived in the future, it was going to be a physical resurrection. And this, my friends, is what? A physical resurrection. We're going to see the same thing in Luke because Jesus is going to eat fish. We're going to see the same thing in John because remember when Thomas doubted, what did Jesus say? Put your fingers in the holes in my hands. Well, if he was a ghost, you don't do that. You know, we're talking about a physical resurrection here. So they grab hold of his feet. Jesus is not a spirit. He is physical. And what does he tell them? What does he say to the women?
Don't be afraid.
Don't be afraid. Now, I'm experiencing deja vu all over again. Who said don't be afraid?
Jesus.
Well, Jesus did. Who said it a little bit earlier in the story?
The angel.
The angel. Jesus says, go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. Now, the angel said what? Go and tell the disciples. How has Jesus changed it? So he's saying the same thing the angel said. So their mission is the same, right? But he changes it from disciples to brothers. Why would he call the disciples?
They bring bread.
But remember, what about the disciples? What can we say about the disciples before the crucifixion? They were a big failure, even in Matthew, because Matthew follows Mark so closely. Remember, the disciples were a mess. One denied him. One betrayed him. The rest ran away.
They were afraid to be crucified.
That's exactly right. Remember, in Mark, the young man says, go and tell Peter and the 10. Now he's going to go tell Peter and the other disciples. We got something similar. Now the people that betrayed him, Jesus is considering what?
His brothers.
Which means what must have happened?
They become family.
Their family
He forgave them.
again. Their family again. Jesus so has forgiven them. And go to Galilee. There they will see me. Now, what do the women do? Women do what they're told. Right? Now, if we look at, and we got other things we're going to hear about. We're going to hear about the soldiers lying, the priest telling the soldiers to lie. We're going to hear a little bit about Judas that doesn't show up in the Gospel of Mark, what Judas does. And then we're going to have his appearance in Galilee on the mountain. if we were looking at this story by itself, how is Matthew describing the resurrection? What is the focus of his description? If the focus of Mark's description is everybody during his lifetime let him down. So be real skeptical before you start thinking disciples and apostles are great men, because they really dropped the ball. You know, what are you going to do? They failed him. What are you going to do about it? That's the point in Mark. What seems to be the point here? What is the point in Matthew? What does Matthew want us to believe?
We're forgiven.
What's that? Jesus wants them to do what? To tell people about it. To tell people what occurred. And the women
Do it.
do it. So the women, this isn't a challenge. Matthew isn't giving us a challenge. What is he giving us?
Instructions.
He's giving us instructions and an example. He's giving us examples of what you do. In other words, in Mark, don't be like the women who leave and tell nobody. Matthew is saying,
Be like the women.
be like the women, because they did exactly what they were told. And as soon as they did what they were told, who was with them? When you do what God has called you to do, Jesus is going to be with you too. Going to be with you too. Okay. Different account of the resurrection in Matthew. Not a question of which one is right and which one is wrong, because both of them are right. Because both are true. Both reflect truth. Next week, we're going to look at the account in the Gospel of Luke. And instead of having one angel or one young man, we are going to have two. We're going to have two in Luke. So we're going to have a little different story in the Gospel of Luke. Okay, let's have a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you for giving us this time together, and remind us to follow the example, first of these women who do exactly what they are called to do, and later the example of the disciples. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. Thank you.